Hello, we will be with you in just a minute. Welcome. I am Marie Pareto-Hedin, President of the Tufts Senior Connection, a shared interest group sponsored by the Tufts University Office of Alumni Engagement. We design programs that we hope will be of special interest to alums 55 and older, but we welcome persons of all ages who find our programs relevant, intriguing, or both. Today's program could not be more timely. The 2022 elections are less than a year away. How will a variety of factors, for example, redistricting, modeling, polling struggles, voting rights and litigation, and grassroots activism impact this election? We have two eminently qualified Tufts professors to inform us and to answer our questions. Brian Schaffner is the Newhouse Professor of Civic Studies at Tufts University. His research focuses on public opinion, campaigns and elections, and political parties. He is a co-author of the book, Campaign Finance and Political Polarization, When Purists Prevail. Eitan Hersh is Associate Professor of Political Science and Associate Professor of Civic Studies at Tisch College. He studies civic participation, voting rights, and the relationship between election rules, strategies, and the behavior of voters. He is the author of Politics is for Power. Brian and Eitan, welcome to the Senior Connection, and thank you for being with us once again.
Thank you for that introduction. And of course, we're happy to join you. I guess since it's been 2 years, it's time for another election. And so I guess we will once again do our best to try to make some sense of what's going on. So I'm gonna start, and then Eitan's going to follow me. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of setting up how we think about what happens in midterm elections and what political scientists understand to be the ways that we can sort of know what to expect in a midterm election. And so let me just share my screen. There you go. You probably know this already, but of course, one of the truisms, or almost always truisms of American politics, is that the president's party generally loses seats in midterm elections. And you can see that this chart shows how the president's party performed in midterm elections going all the way back to 1934. And there's only 3 cases during that entire time period when the party that held the presidency gained seats in a midterm election. The most recent cases were actually back-to-back midterms. 1998, the Democrats gained a small number of seats in the wake of the sort of backlash against the Republicans' attempts to impeach a fairly popular President Clinton. And then 2002, Republicans also gained some seats. And this was sort of in the wake of the rally around the flag effect, or the rally around the president effect that we saw after 9/11. Otherwise, you could see that the president's party generally loses seats and frequently loses lots of seats. So most recently in 2018, you see that Trump lost, Trump's party, the Republican Party, lost 40 seats in the midterm after his first election. And the election after Obama got elected to office, so in 2010, Democrats lost more than 60 seats in the House. So generally, if your party holds the presidency, you can expect that your party is going to lose seats when it comes time for the midterm elections. And so that's obviously what we would be expecting going into 2022. And part of what we look at as political scientists is actually, there are several political scientists out there who basically use various or look at various factors and try to get a sense of how those factors predict what will happen in midterm elections. And it turns out the models for this are pretty simple. So a model that's basically just looking at what the polls are showing in what we call the generic ballot, which I'll explain in a second, is actually pretty predictive of how the election is going to turn out. And so this graph just shows here along the x-axis is basically just how the polls are looking, or basically how the generic ballot and the polling was looking before election day. And then this is just showing how that party fared when it came to the actual vote on election day. And basically the polls are pretty good at getting the vote, the House vote correct. In only 1 or 2 cases is it off by more than a couple of percentage points. And so actually just looking at what the polls are saying is often a really good guide. And we also tend to, our models also tend to account for the fact that we know the president's party loses seats. And we also want to know sort of how many seats any given party currently has in the House. So sort of thinking about the previous slide, you know, one reason that, for example, Democrats in 2010 lost over 60 seats is that they held a lot of seats that they had in 2006 and 2008, they had made huge gains in the House. And so they had a very large majority in the House. And so they had a lot of seats to lose, actually. One thing that might sort of stave off major losses for the Democrats this year is the fact that the divide in the House is much more narrow, that the Democrats do have a majority of House seats, but it's not a very big majority compared to sort of what they had, for example, in 2010 or what Republicans had in 2018. So this is basically an example of what we call the generic ballot question. And we call it the generic ballot question because pollsters generally, there are some polls that we do within specific congressional districts, but for the most part, we are looking at national polls. And so we don't ask people specifically about candidates running in their district, but rather we ask them, are you planning on voting for the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate in when you vote for House in your district? So this is data from the 2021 Cooperative Election Study, and this is a large annual academic survey that I co-direct with one of my colleagues at Harvard. And so this data comes from November and December of 2021. And this is interviews with 25,700 American adults. And this is weighted to be nationally representative of American adults. And so what this is showing you is that, you know, at least in November and December of 2021, Democrats had about a 4 percentage point advantage over Republicans when it came to how people said they were going to vote in the 2022 House races. But I also want to highlight, of course, that there are a lot of people in this bucket, in the not sure bucket, who are not basically committing to voting one way or another yet. And so some of these people are not going to vote, and some of these people might break hard in one direction or another. And just to give you a sense of like, how does this look like, how many people are really changing their minds? What this table shows you is how people say they're going to vote for House in 2022 down this column, and then how people did vote in 2020. And so, you know, one thing to point out here is like most people who voted for Biden in 2020 are still going to vote for a Democrat again in 2022. Most people who voted for Trump in 2020 are going to vote Republican again in 2022. Some of these voters are saying that they're not sure right now how they're going to vote. Of course, if that group breaks hard in one direction or another, then that could make a big difference. But most likely, most of these individuals are just going to end up voting the same party. So what we see when we sort of re-interview people across multiple elections is that over 90% of people who voted Democrat in one election vote Democrat in the next election, and over 90% of people who voted Republican in the last election vote Republican again in the next election. So there's not a lot of mind changing that goes on. So of course, another factor that might matter here is turnout, which, you know, often does have a big effect in midterm elections. We see huge swings often in terms of turnout in midterm elections. So 2018, we had the highest turnout in any midterm election going back to the beginning of the 20th century. Whereas in 2014, we had one of the lowest turnout rates of any midterm election. going back decades. So, you know, what turnout looks like can also matter here, of course. One thing to know, though, is like, while that initial generic ballot result that I showed you from the cooperative election study looks sort of more favorable for Democrats, what we tend to see is that during the midterm election year, the ballot, the answers to that generic ballot question generally tend to trend towards the party that doesn't hold the presidency. So you can see that, for example, for most of 2021, Democrats held an advantage on that generic ballot question, but we began to see a bit more of an advantage for Republicans that happened here after the beginning of 2022. And that's pretty typical for what we'll see in the polling in most midterm election years, that the generic ballot tends to shift a bit towards the out party, the party that doesn't hold the presidency during the year of the election. And so we're seeing that again this year. And the most recent polls, these are polls, the polling average from 538, we're seeing that actually Republicans hold about a 2 percentage point advantage over Democrats. So one thing, of course, that matters here is the extent to which votes for the House actually translate into seats for the House. So, you know, earlier I showed you that there's a very strong relationship between what the polls say and how the votes will actually shake out nationally. But often, or sometimes at least, there's a disconnect between how the votes for House look and then how that translates into actual seats, right? And, you know, one thing we often point to in terms of this discrepancy is redistricting and how the districts are drawn. So during the past decade, the maps that were drawn for the US House of Representatives tended to favor the Republicans more. And so Democrats, in order to win a majority of House seats, often had to actually win the national House vote by a few percentage points in order to see that translate into a majority of seats in the House. Interestingly, so a lot of people going into this redistricting cycle expected that Republicans would once again draw maps that would be to their advantage. But what they didn't count on is that Democrats were actually going to be much more aggressive this cycle in terms of drawing their own districts. So what most analyses of the current state of redistricting look like right now is that it's actually pretty balanced. So if you look at the old maps, essentially, or a change, so this is sort of what the old maps look like here, and this is what the new maps look like. And what we're seeing in terms of most analyses is actually that Democrats have actually added a few Democratic leaning seats to those districts that have been drawn and taken away a few Republican leaning seats. And again, this is because there's been some pretty aggressive district drawing in Democratic states this cycle, when in previous cycles, Democrats maybe weren't as aggressive about drawing pro-democratic maps. So states like New York, for example, have been pretty aggressive about drawing pro-democratic maps. And you can see the context of this, and this there's a great New York Times article last week about this process and how it's sort of turned out. And this graph here is showing you that across over time here, what the Republican advantage has been in terms of seats leaning Republican or Democratic. And you can see going back to 1992 that Republicans have had a pretty consistent advantage in terms of having more seats leaning towards the Republican Party than towards the Democratic Party. So even in the 2020 elections, for example, there were 11 more seats leaning Republican than were leaning Democratic. But most analyses of this current election cycle indicate that actually the Republican advantage is going to be almost nothing for this new set of districts. Not all the districts have been finalized. There are lawsuits in various states. Some states have not finalized the map yet. But based on sort of what we have already and what we kind of expect will pan out, it seems like the Republican advantage actually might not be nearly as big this cycle as it has been in the last couple of cycles. And so what that should mean is that the House vote is more likely to translate more directly into how many seats each party wins. So we'll see how that finalizes. But right now, it seems like it's pretty balanced in terms of the redistricting. So going back to the models, so what do these models predict? So again, the main thing, so Alan Abramowitz, who's a political scientist at Emory University, who's been doing these prediction models for years and years, basically just looks at three variables that predict almost 90% of, with over a 90% success rate, predicts how the House seats are going to shake out, and a little less accuracy with the Senate seats for a reason I'll explain in a second. But three variables are just which party holds the presidency, how many seats each party has in the House currently, and then what the generic ballot is showing, what the polls are showing. And so he created this table recently, basically just showing what the models would predict based on what the generic ballot is showing. So if Democrats were ahead by 5 percentage points in the generic ballot, we would expect them to lose 7 seats in the House and perhaps gain 2 seats in the Senate. Okay, that's if they were ahead by 5 points. If the generic ballot is even, if about a roughly equal percentage of people are saying they're going to vote Democratic as Republican, then we would expect Democrats to lose 15 seats in the House this cycle and maybe gain 1 seat in the Senate. But if the generic ballot continues to trend towards the Republican Party in the way that we've seen in the last couple of months, and let's say that Republicans are ahead by 5 percentage points when it comes to the fall, then we would actually expect Democrats to lose 24 seats in the House, and then for the Senate to break even. So, even, I mean, notably, even if Democrats are up in the House vote on the generic ballot, we still expect them to lose seats based on the fact that they have currently more seats and they hold the presidency. And generally, that's a disadvantage. The Senate is a little harder to predict, and that's because, of course, which states have Senate elections changes every cycle. And so those are a little more idiosyncratic, both because of which seats are up, but also because of those races are higher profile races. But of course, we know that there's probably about 8 races that are likely to be at least somewhat competitive. And Democrats have to win 4 of those in order to keep control of the Senate. And by keep control, I mean keep a 50-50 division with Vice President Harris breaking the tie. This just is a sort of rundown of what those races look like. There's 3 open seats among this group. Pennsylvania is the most Democratic leaning state that has an open seat. North Carolina and Ohio both have open seats, but those states have trended or have voted more Republican in recent elections. And Democrats have to defend, these 2 seats that they won just 2 years ago in special elections that are in states that did vote Democratic in 2020, but by the narrowest of margins, and may very well revert back to sort of a Republican trend in a midterm election cycle. So, it's very possible that Democrats can somehow thread the needle here and win 4 of these seats, or at least 4 of these seats, to maintain control of the Senate, but it's not necessarily an easy task by any extent. So that's sort of what to expect based on sort of how political scientists look at the fundamentals of these things. Now I will turn it over to Professor Hirsch, who will talk a little bit more about what's been going on with voting laws and other things of that nature during this cycle.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Can you hear me? Okay, I hope
Yes.
you can hear me. Okay, good. Hi, everybody. It is so nice to be with you. Like Brian said, I'm going to talk a little bit from a different angle about how to think about the elections. Part of my work is in voting rights, and oftentimes, especially recently, political scientists like me go to court and try to assess claims about voting administration, voting rights, everything from how do voter ID laws affect people of different races? Is there evidence of people voting more than once, or of non-citizens voting? In the 2020 election, there were a number of issues about mail balloting because of the use of mail balloting due to COVID. So there were questions about, was the post office sending ballots in quickly enough to be counted. So a lot of my work in the last couple of years has been focused on these issues, and a lot has been changing over time, and a lot is in question right now related to voting rights for a couple reasons. There's obviously long-term reasons related to a kind of a liberalization over time of election laws. Probably when many of you were young, there was, just voting on election day. The hours weren't necessarily convenient. There was, you had to register well in advance of an election. You could only vote in person unless you had a written excuse. And most states have moved to a much more liberal perspective about voting, with extended voting during the non-working hours of the day, with liberalizing voter registration requirements so that you don't have to register so far in advance. Many states allow for you to vote for many, many days or weeks, even in early voting or absentee voting. So there's been that overall trend. And of course, in 2020, there are two other things happening. One is COVID and states really quite suddenly changing their rules related to mail balloting. And then there's the allegations primarily from the political right and from President Trump about voting fraud and election security. So there are responses to that the Democratic Congress and president have been focused on, and those debates and those proposals, I think, fall into three broad categories. So the first category, and this is the first major thing that the Democrats tried to do when they came into power after the 2020 election, was essentially nationalizing a lot of ideas that some states have been trying out. So nationalizing early voting and same-day registration, pre-registration of young people, so 16, 17-year-olds being able to register in advance while they're still in high school. The Democrats proposed a lot of ideas like making Election Day a national holiday, changing the rules about partisan gerrymandering, changing the rules about campaign finance. Actually, quite dramatically, the Democrats proposed to have a very generous matching for low-dollar donors. And so the Democrats came into Congress and they kind of bundled all of these things up into a big bill, and it went nowhere, and it probably won't ever go anywhere. There's a lot of controversy around what the Democrats are proposing, in part because they were just nationalizing a lot of elements of election law that tend to be or have historically been state decisions. So right now there are a lot of state-by-state variations around election administration. Here in Massachusetts, for example, the state legislature just recently debated, and I think are not going to move forward on a proposal to have same-day registration. There are interesting issues in different states. In Massachusetts, particularly in the Boston area, where you have the student population growing, making the city like twice as big during the school year, some people have concerns about people coming in and all of a sudden registering for the first time and voting. Some people like that idea, some people don't like that idea. So that's kind of a state-specific issue. And of course, lots of states have state-specific issues. So there's some people who think that we shouldn't have nationalized rules like this. There's also kind of a lot of controversy over what some of the proposals were. So for example, the campaign finance provisions that the Democrats have been proposing are quite controversial. They were trying to promote low-dollar donors, and the idea is to kind of take power away from larger donors. But there's a bunch of evidence from political scientists that low-dollar donors are very polarizing. They tend to support highly polarized candidates, and so promoting that kind of low-dollar donation has its own set of issues. In any case, that's one category of things that the Democrats tried to do, and it didn't go anywhere, and it probably won't ever go anywhere. The second broad category of things the Democrats have been trying to do, and that there's been a lot of debate on and a lot of pushback between lawmakers and courts, has to do with the Voting Rights Act from the 1960s. And in recent years, the court has limited the strength of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in a number of ways. one of the main things that the Voting Rights Act used to do was provide additional rules for a certain set of states that were called covered jurisdictions. And in covered jurisdictions, which mostly were southern states formerly of the Confederacy, if they wanted to change a rule about elections, like have a new voter ID law or change how they do precincts, they had to essentially seek permission from the federal government first. And they had to prove that their change in the law wasn't going to make voting harder for protected racial and ethnic minorities. During the Obama administration, the court, in the famous case called Shelby County, did away with those with that rule, arguing that the Congress cannot just forever keep certain states in a covered status, that they have to seek permission to change the laws, but other states don't, for reasons that are historical. So for example, they didn't like the idea that Massachusetts, if it wanted to, could make a voter ID law without asking the federal government's permission, and Virginia couldn't. And Virginia couldn't because Virginia was a Confederate state and needed to seek permission first. The court said, look, if you want to change this formula of what states are covered and what states are not, over time, then that's fine, but you can't just keep the standard from the 1960s. A very controversial ruling, and it's controversial because the rationale that the court used is not from the Constitution, whereas the Constitution very clearly says that Congress has the authority to enforce amendments, including amendments that guarantee equal protection for racial minorities to cast ballots. There's also a more recent case just last year called Brinovich, which dialed back some of other aspects or changed some other aspects of the Voting Rights Act. So another thing that Democrats want to do, in addition to sort of the grab bag of voting access rules, is say create a new coverage formula for the Voting Rights Act and try to provide additional teeth to the Voting Rights Act that have been dialed back by the courts. I think that had a possibility of passing in a narrow way, but I mean, this is now sort of interpretation. I think once the Democrats tried to do the first giant grab bag bill first, there was really no chance of this other stuff happening. But there remains one other bin of election administration rules that I think are on the table and are very likely to happen, not between now and November, but between now and 3 Novembers from now, is rules related to election certification. So as you all remember, what happened on January 6th was connected to not what happens exactly in polling stations, like how people vote, but it's about how states and Congress counts and certifies votes. Some of you will know this, but the rules and the laws that we have about procedures in terms of the federal procedures come from the aftermath of the 1876 election with Rutherford B. Hayes, well, he won by 1 vote with the Electoral College, but after some controversy in the Congress having to deal with it, so they passed a law called the Electoral Counts Act, which governs the procedures that happen in Congress after the election. And I think there is interest from both Republicans and Democrats to try to amend this procedure. Separate from the federal procedures, there is a big question about whether states are going to move in a direction in which they will kind of perform the post-election function of counting votes fairly and reporting those fairly counted votes to Congress, especially for the Electoral College, or whether they will move away from a democratic system of vote counting and more toward a different kind of system in which elections are determined for presidency by a state legislature, which of course is democratically elected, but not by necessarily voters casting ballots for the president. I think a lot about the presidential elections are up in the air and how they'll be governed in the next few years. But I guess that might be a topic for the 2024 installment of this conversation rather than the 2022 one. In the meantime, the states are changing and have changed some laws about voting access and use of the absentee ballots. A lot of states are trying to figure out how they want to use absentee ballots as an ongoing basis after COVID. And they're trying to figure out how they're also going to either dial back or ramp up a kind of politicization of election administration. Just recently, I learned that there's now a legal aid fund for election administrators at the local level who sometimes are facing now difficult lawsuits and threats for trying to run elections. It's a highly politicized area, even more than it's ever been. And so there's a lot to figure out still about what's gonna happen in this coming election, and of course the ones after that. So let me stop there. We're at 5:30 and bring Brian back on here, and we are happy to field your questions.
Thanks, everyone. We have a lot of questions coming in and a lot were pre-submitted as well. I'm going to start with one that came in, which was, is there something inherently wrong about redistricting, or is it just part of the democratic process?
Inherently wrong. Yeah. I mean, I think it's inherently part of our democratic process, the way we've constitutionally built our government. And so, I suppose people might argue for different approaches to how to elect the legislature, some sort of proportional representation approach or whatever, but that's very far afield from what we have now. It's certainly not something that we could change in this country without, vastly changing the Constitution as it's currently written. So in that regard, we, like the reason that we draw districts is to ensure that they are relatively of equal population. And the fact that then that is sometimes done for partisan gain is perhaps not particularly a positive thing, but also maybe not a particularly surprising thing. And it's not clear. I think that it's inherently bad to have lots of districts that are strongly Republican or strongly Democratic. So one could make an argument that, well, if everyone in a district is Republican, then everyone in that district is likely to get pretty good representation because they'll have a Republican representative. Whereas in a divided district, about half the district is not maybe getting good representation from their representative if we think that the people who voted for the other side aren't going to be as well represented. So one could make a case that maybe actually having fewer competitive districts means more people are being better represented. But I think you could also make a case that also makes government less responsive because elections are going to be less of a corrective than they would be in a case where we have more competitive districts. Eitan might have some additional points to make on this front, but
no thanks.
Yeah.
I was just going to say a follow-up question is that if a district is more inherently made to be red or blue, then those primaries become a lot more important. And how do you think that changes with, say in what used to be a swing district is now a Republican, very red district, and now you're having the two sides of the, the growing expanse of the Republican Party against each other. How do you think that's going to affect kind of the elections coming up?
I mean, I think it's definitely true that like if the primary election is the deciding election rather than the general election, that is probably problematic. I more from the point of the fact that we know that the percentage of people who vote in primaries is so low compared to in general elections, and ideally we would want more people weighing in on who's going to represent the district rather than fewer. So yeah, I think that can be a problem. At the same time, I think there's the political science literature. I mean, again, Eitan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the political science literature has shown conclusively in any way, shape, or form that primary elections are sort of causing polarization in the United States. I don't think that they're helping, but I also don't think that it's like the primary thing that's causing us to be more polarized.
Yeah, I basically agree with that. I mean, I think the existence of primary elections is polarizing. In other words, I think that, many years ago when party committees chose candidates instead of voters choosing candidates, they chose candidates who were kind of more establishment people. And so it's hard to imagine as many, if we had a system of like party committees choosing people, it's hard to imagine as many kind of extreme and unqualified people running. But what the political science literature is really clear on is that the various rules we have about primaries, like whether we have primaries that are open to independents or not, or all the various different rules we have in different states of primary rules, that seems to have no effect on polarization.
I was going to say that leads in. We had a couple questions come in about, Brian, your charts talking about whether Americans wanted Democrats or Republicans, and if there was data about something outside of that system, or someone going for an independent, or how those independents are going to change, make any differences going forward, relative to Biden and Harris and leaders, and the impact on the midterms.
Yeah. So, I mean, the question itself allows people to say that they would vote for another candidate or a third party candidate. We generally find that most people don't want to vote for third party candidates or independent candidates. Part of that is because we are in a two-party system, and people don't necessarily want to waste their votes on candidates who are unlikely to win. But also, we see in polls a lot of people who claim to be independents really aren't independent at all. So, like one thing, when we ask people, are you an independent, Democrat, Republican, independent for what? People who say independent, we often ask a follow-up question that is, do you lean more towards the Democratic or Republican Party, or neither? About of voters, about 12% say neither. So of everyone who votes, only about 12% are saying that I don't really even lean towards one party or the other. Among the independents who say they lean Democratic or lean Republican, those individuals vote just as loyally for that party as people who say they're strong Republicans or strong Democrats. So even though we see these polls that say, oh, so many Americans are independents, at the end of the day, it's not really the case that that's true. A lot of people like to think of themselves as independents, but they don't really behave that way. There are some people who truly are independents. They generally don't like either party. They're kind of voting for the lesser of two evils. But it's actually a pretty small share of those who are turning out to vote in elections.
All right, we have a lot of questions that came in about absentee voter abuse, also about photo IDs. This goes a little bit to what Eitan was talking about, but there's also trying to reconcile that with an increase in voter turnout in some of those groups. So how would you kind of explain to someone who is on one side or the other, like, hey, you're supposedly all these suppression bills, but also these groups are actually getting bigger turnout each time?
Well, I'm not totally clear on the question, but I'll say that one of the most remarkable findings from current 2020 data, but also going back for the last decades of what I call voter liberalization, that is opening up the process to having early voting, absentee voting, all sorts of rules that make voting easier, longer hours, is that these changes have had zero impact on voter turnout. There's tiny exceptions. So like election day registration has been shown to increase turnout by, maybe a percentage point or two, but that's basically it. It's sort of a remarkable thing to think about, that you can make voting much more accessible. People can vote for 30 days. They can vote without registering, and it basically changes turnout not at all. And that's true even in the 2020 data, where we see obviously a major liberalization of absentee ballot rules, but no effect on turnout. The one big effect that we saw in 2020 was that for the first time, absentee voting became politicized. So before that, basically what you saw when you looked at absentee voting data is like the people who tended to use absentee ballots tended to be much older and more partisan, that is more Democrat and Republican, less independent. People across the country liked absentee voting, who used it. It was very popular and states started adopting it. But in 2020, there was a politicization of it, so that even though it had seemed to have no effect on voter turnout, that is the number of people voting, the people who did use it tended to be Democrats. So Democrats, instead of voting in person, were voting early, and Republicans, instead of voting early, absentee, were voting in person. Now, there's a number of really interesting questions about absentee voting that are a cause for concern, that I think that people of all political parties should be concerned about. So, for example, when you vote in person on election day in most states, including where we are in Massachusetts, no one can watch you vote unless you want them to. You can, there's usually a screen, and people are not allowed to campaign within so many feet of the precinct. But in absentee voting, whole groups of people can vote together, spouses can intimidate each other. There's a lot going on that's different. The protocol is different. And I think some people are concerned about those differences in terms of like voter intimidation and things like that, that do make that system different. So I think that is one reason why the proposal to kind of make this a universal national mandate is tricky, because I think there are a lot of people, for totally legitimate reasons, who are concerned about absentee voting. And because absentee voting has no real increase in turnout, I think you can really kind of see upsides and downsides of this. And states, obviously, the devil's in the details. States are making specific kinds of rules about absentee voting that are, of course, some are fine and some are not so fine. But in general principle, I think like there is a lot of interesting questions related to absentee voting that, it would be nice for this not to be a sort of a politicized debate, and have a real conversation about what are the benefits and drawbacks of this kind of voting versus voting in a precinct. So let me stop there, because there's, of course, a lot to say. But Brian, do you want to add anything on that? You're on mute.
I think it seemed like maybe the part of the premise of the question also was related to sort of do voter suppression. We see so-called voter suppression laws target particular groups, but we don't necessarily see turnout among those groups drop. I don't know if you had something to say about that, but is there evidence? I think there's some evidence, but I don't know how widespread it is, that when groups are targeted, they actually mobilize in subsequent elections more. That almost has a mobilizing effect on those groups.
Yeah, it's very hard to study these questions. So if there was a rule that makes it say, you add some cost, make it harder to vote. So like a voter ID requirement for some people makes it harder for people to vote. So you'd expect, okay, this is going to decrease voting among some people. But if you were looking at aggregate turnout, you'd have to also think about the fact that some people might be inspired to vote because they didn't trust the election system, and this makes them trust it more. Or they are angry about the voter ID law. They think it's discriminatory and a discriminatory intent, and so they're energized to vote more because of their anger. And so when you look in the aggregate of, okay, what is the effect of a law like this, it is extremely hard to measure, because there isn't just one factor for just one community or in one direction.
Great, thanks, Brian, also for rephrasing my question a lot more intelligible. We're going to shift a little bit. We had a question about your general opinions on ranked choice voting. I know that was not passed. You're both laughing. I'm not sure why. That was not passed in Massachusetts, but I know it was used in the New York mayor race and some other places. So I don't know your thoughts about that, or if you think that might affect elections coming up.
I'm laughing because I know Eitan has thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm laughing because this was a proposal in Massachusetts. I kind of reviewed the data on it quite carefully and came to the conclusion that this was a bad idea for Massachusetts. I wrote a Boston Globe op-ed saying that this was a bad idea. I kind of took fairly strong public positions against it. And I felt like I was basically, at least in the context of academics, I was certainly not in the majority opinion about that, but lucky for me, I was in the majority opinion of the voters, who actually really count here. Look, I think there even with ranked choice voting, there's lots of ways to do it, and some are better than others. The biggest problem with ranked choice voting, including the proposal that we had here in Massachusetts, was that when it's used in primaries and in non-partisan elections, like a municipal election is not partisan, it's a very tricky process for voters. I mean, if you imagine a situation where there's a Democrat, a Republican, and say a Green Party candidate on the ballot, most people can figure out, okay, maybe I'm a Republican, so I prefer the Republican candidate, and then second choice is the Democrat, and third choice is the Green. All right, but in a municipal election or in a primary, there is no party label. There's just like 10 names. And voters who have to, instead of having to do an easier task of figuring out, oh, is there a candidate I like? You now have to fill out this grid of bubbles ranking many, many candidates. And if you don't rank all of these candidates, then your ballot ends up counting less than the person who does rank all those of those candidates. I think basically this is a policy that makes voting harder, that also makes it a little bit harder for people to understand how the actual mechanism of it works. Like someone could get the plurality of votes, but then lose the election. And I think especially at a time when there's a lot of people who are kind of ambivalent about the election system and its fairness, changing something like that seems like a really bad idea to me. But there are some contexts where states are exploring it and also exploring sort of limited versions of it. So for example, it maybe wouldn't apply in a primary election. And so, you know, I can see some merits of it. But generally speaking, it's one of these proposals, like so many voting proposals, where the reasons to do it as articulated by the advocates are just never in the data. So for example, does it make voting cheaper? Does it raise turnout? You know, there's basically no evidence for any of these things. And so there's a lot of advocacy for, I think, for not very good reason. Not that I feel strongly about it.
All right, we're gonna move on. We have, obviously, you know, everyone knows right now what's going on in Ukraine, but there's a question related to that. Are there relative comparisons to this upcoming primary to other war-related occurring primaries, 9/11, Vietnam, Gulf War? I don't know if Brian, you want to take that to start?
Sure. I mean, so the other comparative baselines that we've mentioned are conflicts that we were in part of, that our own military was engaged in. I think what makes Ukraine maybe a little bit more difficult to sort of sort out what the net effect of this will be on the election outcome is that we're not currently and probably won't really be engaged in a ground war in Ukraine at any point. And if that changes, you know, my answer changes. But it's, you know, like there's been a pretty hard line from the Biden administration that we're not sending troops to Ukraine. So usually what we see when we send troops overseas is there's an initial rally around the flag, rally around the president effect, where the president's approval rating goes up at least for some time before sort of the length of the conflict begins to take a toll on the approval rating. So in 2002, Bush benefited from the fact that sort of we were attacked on 9/11, and then there was, you know, we sent troops overseas, and his approval rating was still relatively high during the 2002 midterm elections. So Republicans did pick up a few seats. I don't see why that would happen here. I think there's, again, we're not sending troops to overseas. I think, you know, Biden's handling of the conflict will obviously impact his approval rating, at least to some extent. And I think maybe you're already seeing some small signs that his approval rating is maybe ticking up a little bit. It's hard to imagine it's going to have an overwhelming effect on the outcome of the midterm elections, though, especially because both parties are pretty unified and for the most part in terms of sort of how they're responding at this point. I think there's pretty strong bipartisan agreement in Congress about various steps for, you know, that various things that Congress has agreed on. There's been a lot of bipartisan votes. You know, it would be a totally different situation if Trump was still president because of his closeness and his support for Putin during his presidency. But it seems like most Republicans have run away from that connection pretty quickly, and voters have a pretty short memory. And so, I struggle right now to see how it's going to affect the midterm elections. And again, we have no idea what this will look like months from now either. But I struggle I struggle to see how it's really going to have a big effect on the midterm elections beyond maybe helping Biden's approval rating a little bit, which might then help Democrats a little bit.
I agree with that. I mean, I think that the only asterisk is if the sort of some members of the Trump wing of the Republican Party are kind of dancing with a sort of a pro-Putin position, and if that increases over the next few months, that could change things. But
sort of a follow-up question about some current issues. A lot of questions came up about inflation and gas prices as kind of being on voters' minds. Are there other things you guys think could kind of push that to the side, whether it's another COVID outbreak or something happening, just something that how these really the question underlying it was how current issues really affect the midterm elections, whether it's the issues we're looking at now or the issues coming up before November?
I mean, I can start and just say that I think in the kind of news cycle that many of us pay attention to these days, we think every event is going to have some amazingly big effect on the outcome of the elections. And yet, as you can see from the first graph I showed, it's pretty predictable that the party of the president is going to lose seats, that our models can, with pretty good accuracy, sort of predict what that's going to look like. And at the end of the day, events don't make a huge difference. Generally, maybe they move the needle slightly in one direction or another, but inflation and gas prices are probably taking a bit of a toll on Biden's approval rating, which is probably affecting the generic ballot polling right now. But again, not necessarily by a ton. But it certainly would have an effect. Another COVID outbreak might also have some effect on that as well. But we're talking about like a few percentage points in either direction. The kind of event that's going to have some sort of like major effect. I mean, just look at Trump's approval rating during the COVID-19 outbreak, like the first few months. That this is like a historic, once in a lifetime event, this the pandemic and the outbreak. And I think if you go back at the data, his approval rating doesn't really move much at all during this, despite sort of fumbling the beginning of it and then kind of going back and forth. Like really, like it's pretty stable, and that's just reflects the fact that we are very polarized right now. There's not really that much that's going to change people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to put an asterisk on that, it would just be that, I think that Democrats this cycle have been, in a number of situations pushing these like multi-trillion-dollar bills. And I think that President Biden has been quite disciplined in the fallout of those, especially as the inflation numbers have ticked up. But there's certainly a wing in the Democratic Party that just wants to spend through the roof. And I think that if that wing of the party is sort of given power or is given a big platform to articulate those views, that would put in a lot of people's head the connection between the Democratic policy goals and inflation.
Sorry, so you're saying basically Joe Manchin is saving the Democrats from themselves?
Don't quote me, but yeah, I think that's.
Just one of the questions that came up was about just trusting the system. I think people on both sides, independents everywhere, kind of just are not sure what to think of how partisan everything has become, whether it's, not trusting social media or foreign influence, or thinking that, there's ballot harvesting or we're not having enough security at these places. So I don't know if you guys have any comments on that. Just how to get people to kind of believe in the system again from both sides.
Yeah, I have thoughts on that. I mean, it's interesting. Something like ballot harvesting is, when viewed through one's own ideological lens, feels quite normal. And when viewed through another ideological lens, it's viewed as horrible. So for example, I remember this story in Massachusetts of an election official who was Republican, but I think, as far as I know, not particularly ideological, who went to an old age home in their community and helped people fill out ballots and then ran them through the machine. And that's not allowed. You're not allowed to go take. But if you think about it, in that one community, if you imagine someone going with absentee ballots and helping them fill it out, and then they bring them to the thing, like if you trust that person and you trust the process, that feels like a good deed. And if you oppose that person and oppose that process and don't, then it feels like fraud. And I think that a lot about election administration right now is just viewed through this prism of total distrust. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that many people are getting their news and spending their time thinking about nationalized political controversies instead of learning who in their community is in charge of stuff and how themselves might be in charge of stuff, right? So if you think about election administrators as like these people that my favorite news channel is telling me are evil, then if you suddenly see an election result you don't like, it's you have very negative feelings and a lot of distrust. But if you know the person and you know how your system works and you know what they do, then because you follow local news and you're involved in your community, then these things are taken like responsible people take them. And so I think there's a big lesson here, which is that the way to resolve some of these incredibly distrustful relationships is for people to actually build relationships in their community. So when an election happens or a school committee meets or whatever, you're not like encountering government for the first time in such a oppositional way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, we need to sort of reach out and be talking to people in our local communities. And I think we also need our politicians to sort of ramp down the rhetoric a bit. I think it's obviously very destructive to have politicians on both sides sometimes sort of calling into question the trustworthiness of election officials, of the way our elections are run, that kind of thing. When you actually talk to these people who actually run elections at the local level, they are like almost uniformly sort of just people who are just basically trying to do their job the best they can. Like they're just like they're really passionate about like making sure their election runs well. They're not really these sort of nefarious actors that politicians on both sides of the aisle would like to have us believe when it suits them to sort of push those narratives. So more generally, I think politicians, I think in the past just used to sort of there's a line that they often would not cross in terms of to sow distrust in government institutions that are sort of so central to the functioning of our democracy. But the fact that now there's sort of this incentive to do that, to go viral on Twitter or raise money or whatever, I think has had some pretty negative consequences, and maybe most obviously on January 6th, but that's certainly not the only instance that we've seen of people sort of taking quite seriously what they're hearing on their favorite news channel from their favorite politicians and then acting on it.
All right, we're getting close on time. We're going to get to a few extra questions. We have a ton coming in. I'm trying to kind of push them together and make sure we can get to as many issues as we can. You guys had mentioned, with the different voting rights acts and the issues, and we actually had a question come in from a canvasser, someone who's actually a canvasser, asking about why people still aren't voting. Like if it's not a law or it's not an issue that's pushing them, what is going to get all these people? Brian, I mean, in one of your slides, it showed, people answering this poll, and I think like 40% hadn't voted at all. So just wonder if you guys have any thoughts on that.
I mean, one thing I'll say is like, we've just had the two highest turnout elections in decades consecutively, I think, in 2020 and 2018. Turnout was sort of pretty high relative to, elections we've been holding for the last century or so. So in that regard, well, actually, like a lot of people are voting, at least recently. But still, even in those very high turnout elections, we're talking about like a third, at least a third of American adults who are not voting. I don't know, like, I don't think it's, it's not even that I don't think, I'm quite sure it's not, has nothing to do with making it easier to vote at this point. That I think it's, you know, some people just simply don't like politics and they're not interested in it. And I'm not sure, you know, whether or to what extent you can do anything to make people who are just not interested in it interested enough to go get invested and vote in elections. So I think that's one thing. So, you know, maybe it's a case of trying to, get people invested by showing them how politics matters to them. But for a lot of people, they just do not care. And then there are people who maybe do care, but are really turned off by sort of politics and the way it sort of functions now. And for that, like, you know, I would say, maybe they need to sort of reorient their view of what politics is, and maybe look beyond sort of the national partisan focused news cycles and look maybe more at like what politics looks like at the local level. But I know, like, Eitan, I know you have a lot to say on this as well.
I'll just add one thing, which is I think that there's been an incredibly damaging trend of a sort of a celebritization of American politics and a nationalization. So yes, turnout in the last 2 election cycles were historically high because there was essentially a TV celebrity on the ballot. And I think that if Brian and I were to place bets about turnout in the next election, we will not expect record high turnout. And not only that, I mean, if we think about, you mentioned the question comes from a canvasser, you know, if I were to poll my US elections class at Tufts, maybe 100 students, before the 2020 election, before the 2018 election, I wouldn't be surprised if a third of them were volunteering for campaigns. And this year, I suspect it's closer to 0. Retirees are another big source of canvassers. I would expect that if I would have asked 2 years ago who had been canvassing, many people on this call would have said yes, and now it's probably close to 0. And the reason why this is true is that people get energized by celebrities on ballots, essentially. And when you get, if you think about Trump, you love him or you hate him, and that's what's going to drive you, then you vote, you act, you get active. But if you're kind of like the status quo is okay, and plus the people on the ballot are boring to me, Joe Biden's boring, Mitt Romney's boring, Hillary Clinton's boring, then you say, okay, well, because it's boring to me, like, I'm not actually going to invest my time either in voting or in volunteerism. And so, this is the politics, we get the politics we deserve.
All right, we probably have a chance for one last question. We always like to end on a question like this. We know our Tufts audience, but what are the best ways for people really, if this is an issue that's important to them, a lot of this issue that you brought up today, the best ways for them to get involved, whether it's locally or sending postcards or working with a nonprofit or election administration? Are there ways that you guys would, kind of put the charge out for everyone to get involved for this next election coming up or elections in the future?
Brian?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that we should all have a general disposition toward our local communities where we can make the most difference, where we can see a connection between national politics and local politics. A lot of the things that people care about, whether that's economic development, election integrity, the environment, racial equality, all these issues are local issues. They affect schools and housing and transit and the election administrators in our own communities. And so I just think it's the #1 thing to do and the #1 way to have an impact. And like nothing like postcard writing or anything like that comes close to the amount of influence someone can have if they take their own community and its own politics seriously.
Yeah, and I would second that. Say, I would just say, I recently wrote a book with a couple of colleagues, and some of the, we think of local politics as being sort of like the ideal, but it's actually a place where we see so much inequality, just as much inequality as we see in national politics. And so, get involved in fixing your local community. And one of the benefits of that is like, to swing a local election or to influence a local official takes so much less work. It's not less work, but your vote in a national election is going to maybe matter very little. That's maybe one reason you don't vote, that people don't vote as much in national elections, because they feel like, well, what's the difference either way? But in a local election, a lot of time, a handful of votes, you get yourself and your neighbors to go to the polls, and all of a sudden you can kind of determine an outcome. Or if you get you and your neighbors to go visit your mayor's office or your local councilor's office, you can have real power. So I'm just really just cribbing from Eitan's book at this point. But it's like I definitely have been won over by his work to sort of realize for myself how important it is to really focus on the local level, where I think you can have a real impact and you can sort of see how your participation matters in a way that I don't think is really true at the national level.
Great. Thanks, Linda. Thanks, everyone. I'll hand it over to Linda to close us out.
Hi, everybody. I'm Linda Dixon from the Tufts Senior Connection. I would just like to add to Brian Schaffner's last point. I just worked as a warden in my local town election, and everything he said is true. It's democracy in action. And I put in a 14-hour day at the precinct, and it's one of my very favorite things to do. Anyway, wasn't that a great program? We truly enjoy having Brian and Eitan join us for every major election, and we look forward to having them again in 2024. If you never got to ask your question, or if you have an additional question, we will be sure to include their contact information in the material that we will send you shortly. So thank you, Professors Schaffner and Hirsch, for explaining some pretty complex topics in simple and straightforward language, and being very charming while you're doing it. And thank you, Amy, our producer, for handling all our technical and our production details. And of course, thanks to you, our wonderful audience, who makes these programs possible. Please take a moment to complete the survey that you will receive shortly after this program. And if you have a program topic that you would love to have the Senior Connection present, please take the time, tell us about it. This concludes our presentation. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to hearing your program ideas for the future. See you all next time. Thank you again, everybody, and good evening.